Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Can you provide me just a feedback? Perfect, super. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to host you and this multi-school panel on sustainability transitions in business. I'm Matteo Mura. I'm the director of the Bologna Business School Center in Sustainability and Climate Change, and I will be managing the whole conversation that we will have today. We have a panel of 7 presenters coming from all over the world. You already have had their CVs and biographies. Therefore, I will not introduce each of them, but they will introduce themselves. I will just provide you a very brief agenda of the next 85 minutes of the overall session. We first will have a 5-minute introduction of each of the presenters on 3 main topics. First of all, the presenters will introduce the sustainability transition agenda, situation, context of their own geographical region and area. Secondly, they will introduce the audience their specific research agenda, and then they'll conclude with some questions for the students. These questions will be picked up in the breakout room sessions that will follow. Therefore, after the presentations of the presenters, we will break out in 7 different rooms, and we will have the chance to be there all together in different rooms, discussing the questions that each of the presenters suggested. There will be a rapporteur for each breakout room. Therefore, when we will join back the main stage, each rapporteur will have the chance to present a synthesis of what has been discussed in the breakout room session. Okay, so we have a pretty tight agenda. Therefore, I will not take more time, and I invite on stage Sandor. Sandor, you are already here. So the first presentation will be delivered by Sandos Lucas de Pereni. Sandor, the floor is yours. Thank you. We cannot hear you, Sandor.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I'll be sharing my... Can you see my slides, guys? Okay, so yes. Can you, I don't see the slides myself, so can you... Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah, thanks. I can see. So, sorry for the inconveniences. My name is Sandor Lucas de Pereni. I'm a researcher at ESAN Graduate School of Business here in Peru. And today I will be presenting the following research topic, which is related to waste management and basically how organizations' deficient and ineffective waste management performance can compromise the legitimacy, competitiveness, and operability. Next, please. Yeah, it's taking time. Yeah, thank you. So according to the latest report by the World Bank, in 2016, we generated 2 billion tons of waste, mostly coming from households and different types of organizations. Next, please. And in 2017, we discarded around 53 million metric tons of e-waste. Next, please. In 2018, we rejected 1.3 million tons of edibles, and 80% of all of these materials ended in the ocean. Now, I'm from Peru, a country, the second largest country in South America with the largest extension of the Amazon rainforest. And we have some other issues like 7 million tons of waste per year, only 700,000 plastics, and all these issues you have been able to see. Now, if we check the future scenario, in 2050, we will be having some huge issues. Next, please. So we're having a very complex scenario where organizations will be scrutinized and assessed in terms of how they are polluting or not polluting the environment. So this is something to take into account. Next, please. So there are two main factors that will drive this problem, which will urban migration, which will increase by 66%, and also next, please. And also we will have a population growth of 40% to 10 billion people. Next, please, Hayden. In general terms, organizations will require more resources to provide more services, more infrastructure, more maintenance, more food, more clothing. So we will have more waste generation, which is more likely to have impacts on the environment. Next one, please. So there will be a huge global environmental pollution we are seeing today. And we're having a lot of different organizations that are assessing and scrutinizing how different entities are managing their waste. Next, please. So we're having media. Next, please. We're having different civil society organizations, NGOs. Next, please. We're having international consumers associations. Next, please. We're having competitors. Next, please. Government organizations. Next, please. Citizens. And all of them will have concerns on the environment. Next, please, Hayden. And these concerns are mainly focused on three main topics, which would be, next, please, Hayden, would be human health. The following one, please. Biodiversity. And the last one would be, next, please, economy. So in general, we will be having a huge waste generation problem. Next, please, Hayden, which will be 3.4 billion tons of waste per year. Now, if we take this context into consideration, studying how organizations will react in this external environment will be very interesting. So I'm personally interested in understanding how organizations behave to external pressures. I'm interested in organizational theory, topics such as circular economy, industrial ecology, industrial symbiosis, nature-based solutions, and so forth. So the question here is, next, please, Hayden. Can organizations' waste management performance compromise the legitimacy, competitiveness, and operability? Just to give some conceptual clarity before going to the questions is, when we talk about legitimacy, we're referring to the degree of support an organization has concerning their activities. When we talk about competitiveness, we're talking about the degree to which an organization can acquire or develop certain organizational capabilities to become stronger or more competitive. And when we talk about operability, we are referring to the extent to which an organization is able to keep its systems functioning despite any internal or external contingencies. Next, please. 3 clicks more, please. So let's go to the breakout room questions, please. And we will have in this 2 main questions will be, next, please, will be, which industries or sectors do you think are more likely to be affected by their own waste generation management? And the second question, please, Hayden, is, does the intensity of society's environmental concerns and government regulations differ or vary across countries? Next, please. Thank you very much. This was my presentation. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sandor. Very interesting presentation on waste management and some very interesting details and figures on that. I think I'm the next presenter, so I ask to move the next slide, please. Okay, so I will be talking briefly on the decarbonization pathways for European industrial ecosystems. Next, please. Some figures on what is occurring across EU in terms of sustainability transition, specifically concerning industries. As most of you might know, in December 2019, the European Commission launched the European Green Deal with the aim of letting EU becoming the first net zero continent by 2050. This target will have to be, in a way, set accordingly to several other targets. The next one will be for 2030, where we are expected to have a decrease of minus 55% of CO2 emissions compared to 1990. Related to this, in 2020, last year, the EU launched the related Next Generation EU funding scheme that will support the European Green Deal financially. This Next Generation EU fund is expected to mobilize as much as 750 billion euros between 2021 and 2026, with the aim of addressing major social and economic impact of the transitions. Specifically detailing the Italian situation, as most of Italian students might know, we recently approved, our government recently approved the National Plan for Resilience and Recovery, called the PNRR, that aims at funding 192 billion euros, 40% of which will be specifically dedicated to green transitions, specifically concerning two main topics that are energy transition and transition in infrastructure, mobility infrastructure, and city-related infrastructure. This said, we have to acknowledge the fact that overall, Europe is performing quite well in terms of CO2, decreasing CO2 emission. As you might see in the figure, compared to the emission of 1990, we currently reported a minus 24% in emission. Therefore, we achieved the 2020 target that was minus 20. However, with this trend, unfortunately, we are expected not to meet the 2030 or 2050 target. Therefore, different transition pathways, specifically concerning industries, need to be explored and managed and implemented. Next, please. In this context, my research team that I direct together with my colleague, Margherita Longo, is focused on several research areas on transition pathways. I will show you some figures coming from three main pillars of our research. The first stream that we are tackling refers to a specific category of companies that are called the super polluters. There is a lot of conversation going on in Europe that talks about a policy that can fit all sizes and sectors of companies. Unfortunately, a one-size policy does not fit all. There are the so-called super polluters that account for most CO2 emissions out there. Just to give you a brief figure, consider that as industrial companies, 2% of them account for as much as 43% of their overall emissions. If we only consider the energy sector, 2.5% of the power plants in Europe account for as much as 50% of the overall emission across EU. And we recently published this data in a paper on energy policy. The second stream of research that we are focusing on refers to policies, and in particular, the policies related to the carbon trading schemes, the emission trading system that was launched in Europe back in 2005. The ETS is currently a very interesting policy scheme, not just because it was one of the first one to be launched globally, but also because we're starting to have some interesting data that shows that this policy scheme presents some interesting outcome. For example, the phase 3 of the ETS that was launched and implemented in 2016 showed very steep declines in emissions in most sectors, okay, avoiding decommissioning of plants and carbon leakages. But we could discuss this maybe deeper in the breakout room. The last stream of research that I would like to share with you refers to possible transition pathways, strategies that company can implement, and that refer to decoupling CO2 emissions that they produce from their GDP, their turnover that they produce. So the aim of this policy is to improve the economic well-being of companies, but at the same time decoupling their economic growth from CO2 emissions. This said, we have mapped more than 400 industrial ecosystems across the EU, and the positive figure is that 56% of this EU industrial ecosystem are able to fully decouple their economic growth from CO2 emissions. And they are in a pathway that we named as Green Growth Pathway. Unfortunately, 56% is not enough, as much more ambitious plans in terms of decoupling strategies should be implemented. And this is another topic that we might discuss in the breakout room later on. Next, please. Therefore, in conclusion, I would like to leave you with some questions to be discussed. The first one refers to the following. Is a low carbon transition pathway occurring in Europe? If this is the case, how can you accelerate, how can your company accelerate this transition? And finally, in terms of skills and knowledge, which skills are required to manage these transitions? So hopefully we'll have the chance to discuss deeply this question in the breakout room. Thank you very much for your attention. Next presenters, please.
Hello, I'm Bolesław Rok. I'm from Kosmiński University in Poland, in Warsaw. I'm going to talk for a while about positive impact entrepreneurship. Next, please. Next slide. So, as I said, I'm from Poland, so we are similar to Matteo from European Union. And I think that what is important that the legislation and policy priorities are coming from Brussels. And I think that it is in a way beneficial in terms of the necessary sustainability transition. And as was mentioned by Matteo, also to accelerate this transition, because we know that all current production and consumption pattern systems are unsustainable already, and that corrective action is urgently needed. So we have, luckily, in the European Union, the EU Green Deal, and which is based on a different area. And so, of course, we have this common vision for climate neutral Europe, which is based on priorities in circular economy or ecosystem restoration, decarbonization, social inclusion, of course. But I think that one of the most important point, especially, but not only for the financial industry, is sustainable finance disclosure regulation, with this goal of reorient capital flows towards innovation for a more sustainable Europe and sustainable economy. And of course, we have this shift from traditional, let's say, investment to impact investment. And it brings to the area all innovative idea and startups. And of course, we can put a question, is it an aspirational benchmark only, or it is the first stage of a fundamental change? Next, please. So in this case, I think that sustainability transitions depend on the emergence and spread of diverse forms of innovation. And it's so we must make this happen in the next 5 to 10 years, and time is running out. So that's the reason that I'm talking more about, and I'm dealing with positive impact startups, or which is a wider perspective for sustainable entrepreneurship. And it's sustainable entrepreneurship and different innovative companies has the potential to create radical, not just incremental change in the face of the climate catastrophe. I don't think that, big multinationals will solve all our problems. I'm quite sure that all those innovative ideas are really necessary, because we have to redesign business models, and we have already a lot of examples across the whole world. Thousands of innovative startups which are really redesigning the whole economy. And I strongly believe that the rising tide of those positive impact startups will sink the traditional business, because it will enable and at the same time facilitate a radical increase in social, ecological, and economic efficiency. And we will discover, and we will be part of this new wave, a new era of innovative business, sustainable business. Next one. So I'm going to discuss. Next slide, please. So I'm going to discuss with you in the breakout session, three main questions. I think that's quite obvious. The first one is, what is the main driver for positive impact entrepreneurs development? Is it really an individual passion for change? Or maybe access to impact investors? Like I mentioned before, this impact investment is really growing pretty quickly. Or maybe individual values, purpose-oriented minded people. So, and then the second, which industries have the greatest innovation potential for the climate? We know already, ethical fashion, or vegan food, mobility, renewable energy, packaging alternatives, urban mining. We have to select, which sectors, which industries have this greatest potential, and also, and in fact, asking you, what do you think about that? And also, just the last question is, I will ask you to think about the craziest innovation that you would like to introduce with the highest possible social environmental impact, so far even impossible to implement. What would have to happen for such innovation to appear on the market? Technology or financial capital, or maybe push from the regulators or market pool? So we will talk about that in the breakout session. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Michael Rüdiger. I'm professor of international business and supply chain management at Munich Business School. And so therefore, the focus of the next few minutes will be, what impact does supply chain management have on sustainability? And we'll talk, about a concrete example, at the example of biofuels in Germany. Let's go to the next slide. As you all probably know, sustainability is a topic that, everybody talks about at the moment. It doesn't matter if it's Europe, Asia, Africa, Latin America, it's on everybody's mind. We're starting to see the impact, the necessity to act. And so the first point here are a couple of the developments, that we're seeing in Germany. So the first one is, recognition that action regarding climate change is a global challenge. From a supply chain perspective, obviously, this is a really important statement, because it means that, yes, while we can have individualized national initiatives to do something, the overall approach has to be a global one. And you will see in a few minutes that, a closer integration of efforts, of initiatives to do something really is needed. Matteo had spoken about the European Green Deal, the goal that a 55% emissions reduction compared to 1990 level is supposed to happen by 2030. At least from a German perspective, it does not look like we're going to make this happen. We're getting close, but, not quite. In addition, because we have recognized that, the burning of fossil fuels is detrimental for the climate. There are different initiatives to combat that. The coal phase-out law is one in Germany, which means that all coal-firing power plants will be turned off by the year 2038. In addition, Germany has decided that nuclear power is also not what we want to focus on. And by the end of next year, all nuclear power plants will be turned off. So if we sooner or later get rid of coal, if we get rid of nuclear power, yes, we have renewable energies, you know, wind, water, solar, but for the time being, you know, there still is a need for traditional, you know, fuel burning sources of power, you know, for cars, for trucks. And so there has been a heightened focus on biofuels, not only in Germany, but in other European countries, in the United States, you know, in different Latin American or Asian countries. And so on the right side, you can see what is called, you know, the German Sustainable Development Initiative or Strategy 2021, which in the end is not a bad effort. But if you look at the different, you know, boxes on there, you know, we have isolated initiatives that are supposed to combat, you know, different aspects of not being sustainable. And so also really important when we talk about sustainability is the recognition that, you know, in the end, there are three components to sustainability. One, the economic aspect of sustainability, you know, businesses have to survive. That's been around for a long time. But we now have added, in terms of a triple bottom line approach, you know, ecologic and social considerations, so that in order to be sustainable, we need to make sure that the impact on the environment is minimized. A big topic here, like just said, you know, the CO2 emissions. But in order to be sustainable, we also have to make sure that, you know, the social impact of what we're doing is sustainable in the long term. And we will see that those isolated building blocks that we have here, you know, numbered 1 through 17, in the end, like I said, are great initiatives, but oftentimes the interconnection and the interrelationship is not considered enough, so that something that we might be doing to reduce CO2 emissions in terms of social sustainability, fighting hunger or poverty, has, you know, a quite negative impact, or that initiatives that we're doing on a national basis to reduce CO2 emissions might actually have a detrimental impact on CO2 emissions in another country. So if we could go to the next slide, we look at this a little bit more in terms of, you know, CO2 emissions and biofuels. So like it just said, you know, the first bullet point here, a lack of understanding of complex systems. Sustainability relates to the natural world, therefore very few systems are isolated. Absolutely. You know, if I'm saying I'm using biofuels to reduce CO2 emissions that are generated when we drive our cars, trucks or buses, might actually cause a reduction of CO2 emissions in Germany, but depending on where the biofuels come from, depending on how we get that resource, it might actually cause an increase of CO2 emissions in other parts of the world. And in the worst case, the increase in CO2 emissions might actually be more or higher than what we save. So the second bullet point here, what we just discussed, you know, a lack of understanding that renewable fuels may not always, they might be, but may not always be CO2 neutral. They can have a negative CO2 balance when looking at the direct as well as indirect supply chain links. So like we said, you know, 60% of the palm oil that's imported into the European Union, we get this palm oil from Latin America, from Asia, from African countries. 60% of this palm oil ends up in the gas tanks of our cars. If we cut down rainforests in other parts of the world to get this biofuel, we are not really doing anything good, even though for us nationally, we can say we impacted our CO2 balance in a positive way. There is certified biofuels out there now, which could mean, well, at least in our cars, we end up with certified biofuels, but that means that, you know, the non-sustainably grown biofuel is then just used for food or cosmetic industry. So the last bullet point here, and we said this and touched on it a couple of times, a lack of understanding that initiatives to reduce CO2 might actually have a bad negative impact on other parts of the supply chain. And there is a topic that is, you know, very dear to my heart. It's called food sovereignty in emerging economies, where we actually see that our attempts to reduce CO2 emissions can actually lead to hunger, you know, in emerging economies, you know, across the globe, that palm oil is grown rather than food crops, which can have a very negative impact. So like we said before in the first bullet point, it is a global problem. And if we go to the next slide, we see, the 3 questions for the breakout session is, how can we entice governments, NGOs, possibly companies to work closer together in a multi-nation spanning approach to sustainability? Because like we said before, there are no walls at the border, that reduce German CO2 from going anywhere else in the world, or that prevent, CO2 generated in another part of the world, to reach other parts. So we need to work together more closely. And this is a major challenge. I mean, we see that even on a national basis, different organizations have a problem cooperating. That different companies have a problem cooperating. And so I realize quite well that saying we need to work more closely together as, as a globe, as many nations, is a big challenge, but we've got to master it. This is something we have to do. So how can we entice governments and NGOs to work more closely? We'll also talk about a little bit, question number 2, what institutions and or bodies need to cooperate to ensure a maximum level of acceptance of the resulting recommendations. It doesn't do us any good if we have, great strategies that are created by, different research or governmental bodies, but that are then not implemented on a national or on a multinational level, like in the European Union, or if companies or NGOs just ignore them. So, how can we ensure this level of acceptance? And then the last point here, going back to the biofuel issue that we just spoke about, when looking at the issue of biofuels, how can social, economic, and ecologic considerations, be brought to alignment? What can we do to ensure that our attempt to reduce CO2 emissions doesn't lead to hunger, for example, in other parts of the world? Difficult questions, but I hope that, we'll have a really fun and interesting time talking about possible solutions in our breakout sessions. Definitely, I do believe that there are solutions out there. I'm an optimist, but let's talk about it. Look forward to seeing you in a few minutes.
My name is Roberto Schaefer, professor of energy economics at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And most of my work builds on energy and climate change. I have been working with energy for the past 30 years. I have been collaborating with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, since 1998. And basically, this is what we're going to be discussing here today. My presentation is going to build a lot on what Michael has just said, which has to do with the issue of, let's say, how to integrate different sectors of an economy, how to integrate different economies themselves, because everything, as Michael said, is very much interconnected. But coming to my first slide here, the next slide, please. What are the main sustainability issues in Brazil? Basically, one problem that we face, not only in Brazil, but in the globe, that because we have a very good understanding now that to keep the temperature of the planet well below 2 degrees, as said in the Paris Agreement, we have a limited amount of carbon that you still can emit from today up to the end of this century. And roughly speaking, this remaining carbon budget varies between 400 and 500 gigatons of CO2. 400 more related to keeping the temperature below 1.5 C degrees of heating, and 600 gigatons keeping below 2 degrees. So basically, we have this limited carbon budget. And we have to have in mind that these remaining carbon budgets have to be split among different countries, but also is between the different economic sectors of these different countries. And let's say, different from most countries, in the case of Brazil, the main issue related to carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions is not related to the energy sector, like is the issue in Europe, for example, or in the US, but is related to deforestation. And that's why it's important to have in mind that deforestation, agriculture, and energy are all parts of the same discussion. And as Michael said, that's why it's important to understand, in the case of biofuels, for example, where does this biofuel come from? What are the environmental implications of that biofuel? Because eventually you may think about an energy sector that's net zero in terms of CO2 because it relies heavily on biofuels. But eventually, if that biofuels leads to deforestation, then it's not true that you're helping the climate of the globe. So in the case of Brazil, let's say it's very important to have in mind that because deforestation, but also agriculture, but mainly deforestation is a key issue of greenhouse gas emissions, let's say, the Brazilian economy should be very much concerned about deforestation, because if you emit more in one sector, the remaining carbon budget of the rest, for the rest of the economy, is much reduced, and then you have to rely on very costly technologies to reduce emissions in your sectors, because other sectors are emitting more than would be necessary to do their job. So what are my area of research? So over the past 20 years, I have been leading a group which has developed a series of global and national integrated assessment models. These integrated assessment models are very much the backbone of the current IPCC reports. And what's important, let's say, when you have these integrated assessment models, is that you exactly see that, let's say, how different countries compete for the remaining carbon budget, how different sectors of the economy compete for that remaining carbon budget, and then you can use those models, let's say, to devise least cost mitigation pathways that, let's say, can be associated with different economies, which can be associated with different sectors of those economies. Next slide, please. So basically, these IMs, these integrated assessment models, let's say, have proved to be key for IPCC reports, so as to help countries develop their own NDCs, and countries also develop their mid-century strategies. And then next, my final slide here. What are the questions that I want to focus during our breakout group? So basically, what I want to focus here is, let's say, if you look at the past, let's say, energy transitions, we can realize that past energy transitions from wood to coal to oil, they happen naturally, which is not the case of the energy transition that's going to be needed now. The energy transition that's going to be needed now will have to be engineered. So basically, the question I want to discuss in our breakout group is what? Let's say, how the power sector of the future will need to look like, how the transport sector of the future will need to look like, which energy carriers we have to be used for the so-called hard-to-abate sectors like steel producing or aviation or shipping, how fast and how these energy transitions you need to take place to avoid economic disruptions. And finally, if you have time to discuss, let's say, whether or not a net zero global economy is really going to be needed, and then try to make a strong, let's say, this differentiation between net zero CO2 and net zero greenhouse gases. Thank you very much. We meet later on in our breakout group. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm next. My name is Dr. Rosina Watson. I'm head of the sustainability group at Cranfield School of Management in the UK. Go on to the next slide. So what I thought I'd do is share the view of EMBA students in the UK that I've been teaching about sustainability recently. And a lot of what I'm going to say here is actually quite optimistic. So from the perspective of the UK, we're finding that rather than seeing sustainability as an activity that you do somewhere on the side, companies are really starting to see that sustainability needs to be embedded into their core strategy, and that an effective response to social and environmental issues is really critical to their long-term business performance, not only to help manage and mitigate reputational and physical risks, but also to increase their attractiveness as an employer and a supplier, and to drive innovation and growth. So there really isn't a tension, if you look at things that way, between sustainability and profit. And one of the things that's really helping from the UK perspective is the increasing level of interest in what's known as environmental, social and governance issues from the investor community, with my students in the UK reporting that investors are increasingly holding their businesses to account on sustainability issues. And then thirdly, I'm observing that there's an extension of the realm in which organizations are looking at their sustainability impact, from just being stuff that they control within their own operations to extending far beyond that into the supply chain. If any of you have started to try and think about your scope 3 carbon emissions, so not the emissions that you control directly in your operations, but those that are found in the rest of the supply chain, many organizations realize that's where their big impact is. So the implication of this, building on what my previous presenters were said, is a much more joined up approach to looking at sustainability impacts across the supply chain. There's also an increasing awareness of this link between social justice and environmental sustainability. Perhaps a decade ago, when businesses in the UK started thinking about being more green, there was a expectation that being green meant being more expensive. There's now a realization that if these more sustainable options, whether that's a product or a service, are going to be widely accepted and used and have impact, they need to be affordable and available to all. And also, when I talk about capacity building, whereas before sustainability might have been considered as something that just a department within your company did, or just one person, the sustainability lead in your company did, there's a growing realization that to drive real change, this has to be something that everybody within the organization is accountable for, from the finance team to the marketing team to the research and development team. And that there needs to be a culture that enables employees, wherever they are in the business, to seek opportunities to do things differently and better. And then the last point is about collaboration. So really building what Michael said. To drive sustainability transitions, we need collaboration between businesses, civil society, governmental organisations. And this is something that companies, I think, are starting to realise. Not everybody has the answers, and sometimes it's difficult in a commercial organisation to be humble enough to recognise that. But this question of collaboration is central, I think, to achieving the SDGs. It is SDG 17. And that's what my research is all about. So if we can go to the next slide. So my research is about collaborations and partnerships for sustainability. So I've looked at what the capabilities are that companies need, not only to work effectively with their partners, with other stakeholder groups, but how to share that learning across the organization. So it's not just the people who are directly involved in those partnerships that learn, it's the whole organization. So that creates a positive feedback loop, so that next time the organization partners, those partnerships are even more effective. So it's about organizational learning around partnering as well. Next bit of the slide. I've also looked at partnerships specifically between business and NGOs, where there might initially be a degree of discomfort when working with an organization that's very different from you, that's not a profit-oriented business, but more societal, environmental purpose business, and looked at what makes those partnerships effective. And that's all about recognizing the difference between you and your partner, and considering those differences not as a source of problems, but as a source of new ideas and a source of innovation. Next slide. So as well as researching around collaboration, I try to bring that into practice in the way we think about and teach sustainability in Cranfield, and 2 examples of that. So I sit in a school, in a business school, but my university has technical schools that look at the water sector, the carbon capture, alternative energy sources, hydrogen, etc., alternative vehicles. So through the sustainability network that we've created across Cranfield, we're trying to harness the power of technology plus leadership and management skills to drive change. And that's culminated recently in us launching a new sustainability MSc apprenticeship. So this is a part-time online apprenticeship around sustainability that brings together exactly those technical skills and those leadership and management skills. So we're trying to collaborate, we're trying to practice what we preach, and collaborate across the disciplines and the schools within the university to help people like yourselves become well-rounded, sustainable, literate leaders, which are exactly the kind of leaders that we need for the future. Next slide. One of the ways that we do this in our teaching is to play this game. It's a board game called Exploring Future Scenarios. It's been recognised as an example of good practice, best practice in sustainability teaching by the Financial Times. Everyone around the table plays a different actor in society. So you might be a business, you might be a policymaker, you might be an entrepreneur, and all your actions interact with each other, and you influence each other on pathways to a more sustainable future. So we're trying to bring that sort of multi-sector collaboration experience to life with a game. So the questions, next slide, the questions I'd like to discuss in my breakout room are ones I'm grappling with at the moment. So it's fantastic to be launching a specific MSc about sustainability, but I want to know how we could integrate better sustainability into MBA and EMBA teaching. So I'd like to understand from you, as you're the experts on this, where does sustainability appear currently? Is it just in a sustainability module on your courses, or does it come through in your strategy modules? Does it come through in your supply chain modules? And if it doesn't, where would you expect to feature more? Where are you thinking? Why isn't anyone talking about carbon emissions or social equity in this module? And then finally, what practical steps could be taken to integrate better, so that sustainability becomes the context for more broad context for what you're learning about management and business. And I hope you join me for the breakout room. Thank you very much.
Welcome, everybody. I'm rounding up the entire list of speakers. My name is Arvinder Lumba, and I come from Silicon Valley, and here at Lucas College and Graduate School of Business at San Jose State University. I teach in the areas of operations, supply chain, project management, and medical product development. Next slide, please. One of the things we look here in US in terms of context, US has been pretty much in the forefront when it comes to looking at economic stability of corporations, and has taken, with the new administration, taken considerable strides in environmental sustainability, especially when it comes to trying to reduce the carbon footprint, giving boost to companies that engage in solar or green or clean energy. Decarbonization has been one of the policy points for the new government, and also focus on climate change. We have been, not just in California, but throughout US, have been discussing issues of circular economy and getting engaged in that dialogue. And biofuels, biodiversity aspects are being looked at as well. In terms of more specific to economic stability, procurement practices and making them more sustainable has been on the forefront of organizations. But what has received less attention in all this, not just in US, but in other parts of the world, relatively speaking, is the fact that we still have not focused enough on human sustainability and societal sustainability, the other two pillars of sustainability. And this is including focusing on health literacy for the bottom of pyramid, marginalized populations, pharmacovigilance in terms of gray markets for fraudulent or fake drugs, medications, or devices which may not work well. Nutrition in terms of public health issue. Gender bias, as you may have seen in the news, in terms of employment and promotions, those issues along with pay equity have been on the forefront, capturing media's attention, but not much strides have been taken in that regard. Another key aspect as new industries crop up in terms of solar, green energy, clean energy, there's not been enough focus on worker retraining for the new technology that is coming up, and that distinctively lags behind the speed at which new technology is introduced to the market. And as a result, the adoption is much less than what is originally anticipated. Then I also look at issues of human rights in terms of labor abuses, or if you want to call it labor trafficking in supply chains. In also looking at social justice in various community societies, and cultural literacy, just understanding the differences and cultures in the whole diaspora, wide disparity of workers and their not just cultural, but then their educational beliefs in terms of how they feel about health, etc. There's not enough understanding that is shared all across. So that's something that also needs to be looked at. Some of the issues that I look at in my professional capacity in terms of research, try to focus more on, my research focuses on repurposing products after end of life, remanufacturing, revalorization of products. That's some of the work I did in my colleagues in Japan. Also look at project management, but focusing on new sustainability projects that we look at in terms of cultural sustainability, health literacy areas, and with NGOs, etc. Transparency and safety of human capital in supply chain, as I mentioned earlier, countering human trafficking and labor trafficking across supply chains of an organization is something that has been identified in United Nations Millennial Goals and also being addressed by me and some of my colleagues. Then we also look at resilient public health infrastructure, and that has become much more prominent in the forefront with COVID pandemic, and how not just hospitals and other healthcare providers, but also NGOs can offer services to disadvantaged populations in light of the calamity that we are all facing. And along with this, the relief, pandemic relief or humanitarian relief to nurture and foster societal capital that we have are key issues. Here in this area that we look at, I focus primarily based on my work in medical product development, look at frugal medical and other innovations which do not cost too much and are easily adoptable, provide the functionality that is needed to deliver a certain service for the populations of focus. And then finally, affordable healthcare interventions to provide human sustainability. Some of my work in South Africa, I've looked at in the last interaction that I had with the executive MBA program there, looked at affordable health interventions such as far UVC light to offer germicidal applications for bottom of pyramid populations. And for the breakout session, as humans and societies across the globe are at interesting technological crossroads, we are looking at Industrial Revolution 4.0. 1.0 was just the basic traditional industrial revolution, and then number 2 was the technological revolution, coal, gas, electricity, etc. Then we moved on to number 3, which is the digital revolution with electronics and nuclear. And as my colleagues mentioned, that's something we are now moving away to currently in what is called Industrial Revolution 4.0, smart factory automation, cloud computing, Internet of Things, 3D printing, renewable energy. And then down the road, we may be even potentially moving to 5.0, which is personalization, innovation, inclusivity, user experience, artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc. And so we are really entering what I coin the Solomonics era, and this has been fast-tracked by COVID-19 pandemic. So SO is the social part, which is looking at connected, conscientious consumption. Look, people buying based on online reviews more than personal advertisement or other corporate input. Electric vehicles, solar, providing lending options to micro funding such as kiva.org, and offering charity donations through Amazon.com through Smile organization. Local is location aware services, news, apps like Around Me. You can book a chef for your at home in that regard. Mobile, looking at smart gadgets, as we mentioned earlier. Novelty. Now we are moving to, rather than going for a restaurant, to go to ghost kitchens, taking flights to nowhere. Singapore Airlines is offering that during COVID, instead of vacation, staycation, etc. Crypto, non-fungible tokens. Influencer, follower culture, TikTok, we all are familiar with that. And then finally, the user experience, which is outsourcing experiences, people more engaged in looking at reality shows rather than taking personal experiences, reaction videos, etc. And then finally, the issues for discussion in the breakout room are: how can preservation of human societal sustainability be enabled in this era? And then specifically, I would like to focus on various action items to address health literacy for bottom of pyramid, nutrition issues, pharmacovigilance, or gender bias, or pay equity, worker retraining for new tech, human rights, labor abuses, social justice, cultural literacy. Again, these are a wide, a broad spectrum, but welcome to all students, and hopefully we'll have a lively session in our breakout room. Thank you.
Sure. So let's move on. I think we can stick on our initial agenda of having a 20 minutes open discussion among all ourselves and with all our students that are currently connected. I honestly had a lot of questions that I noted down during the very interesting presentations that I heard so far. We are waiting for also Rosina to join. Let's see if we can bring everyone on stage. Meanwhile, I'll ask all the students if they do have questions, and I'm pretty sure they do have. You can jump in or even type them in the chat. Okay, so I will be happy to take them and ask the presenters. We have a first question by Anna that asks us, why do you think the EU is more focused in environmental topics enacted in the USA, meanwhile USA is the social ones? Is it a cultural topic? So basically EU compared to the US, EU more focused on environment, while the US on social aspects. I have my own feelings, but before that, I would like to ask the presenters if they have any answer for Anna. Anyone?
You start, Matteo.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rosina. Okay, I am my own feeling about that. Honestly, yeah. Thanks, Anna, for a very interesting question. Honestly, I do not really perceive the EU to have focused mostly on the environment. As a matter of the EU Green Deal, there is a large portion of the deal, of the agreement, that is supported by a related fund that is focused on the so-called just transition. That means that besides environmental sustainability, so the transition towards new ways of producing energies, of moving people around, of producing products and goods, there should be also a social support for employees and people to gain new competencies and skills. Just to provide you an example, we heard a presentation just a few minutes ago talking about carbon, the phase out of carbon, right, in the EU. The carbon industry that currently employs in the EU roughly 800,000 employees will be phased out in the next few years, right? Therefore, there is a huge debate around the fact that these 800,000 employees will lose their job. Okay, so this is the most relevant question for this industry at the policy level. Unfortunately, this is not true. Recent studies have showed that within these 800,000 employees, the majority of the competencies of these employees can be moved and can join directly other industries in the renewable energy sectors. That means that just 15%, between 15 and 20% of the employees will have to be retrained, while the remaining 75 to 85% of them will not have to be retrained, but can use their own competencies applied to different industries, okay? In doing this retraining of this 15-20%, there will be a fund that the Commission has approved that is called Just Transition Fund, and this is just an example among others. But I leave the floor to other presenters to join me in this discussion.
And maybe, if I may, I would agree with Matteo 100% that you really, if you look at European development goals, you know, the sustainability in terms of, you know, the social aspect is about 1/3 of the considerations or the work project that we have. I think what does happen is that, you know, whenever we talk about social aspects, you know, the environmental is kind of like seen as isolated. You know, we don't talk about them together, but they're seen as separate domains. Coming back to, you know, why the US, again, I think, you know, the US focuses as much on it as we do, but, you know, in terms of, you know, agreeing that it is an issue to work on, we have a larger percentage of the US population that thinks, you know, the environmental component isn't as dramatic as you would find in Europe. I think that those are the main differences, but, you know, conceptually very close.
Much, Michael. I don't know if Roberto or the other presenters want to share some thoughts. Boleslav, Sandor, Arvinder.
Yes,
I can say something.
I'm
Okay.
happy to jump in, and I'll give you the word, Arvinder. So yes, it's really interesting to see how the Europe and the US have different perspectives on environmental management. And I can speak from Latin American perspective, and I'm trying to generalize, but from our perspective, it's really going to be very, very challenging to manage the economic growth with environmental sustainability, right? On the one hand, you have Brazil that has around 60% of the Amazon rainforest, and then you have Peru that has 16%. So I think that these trade-offs between economic growth policies are going to be very hard. And in addition to this, if you consider also the commercial pressures, for instance, like free trade agreements imposed by the European Union or the US or Latin American countries in terms of certain standards, in terms of environmental standards, certifications, and so forth, there will be a huge challenge for us to adopt these new requirements and these external pressures. So policies here in Latin America take a bit more of time, and because there is also institutional weaknesses that we have to overcome. So this that's a whole different picture from the reality you guys have in Europe and you guys have in the US. I'm not trying again to generalize, but it's a gist of what we have in here in Latin America. This from my perspective. So please, Arvind, happy for you to jump in.
Yes, very quickly. Thank you. I only wanted to mention one of the key differences that I see is resource availability in US and in America in general. We do have more resources, not just natural, but other resources, geographically speaking, compared to European Union as a whole. And in terms of number of people available, using those resources, there's stark differences. So
Jose, can you hear me?
There's much more, focus on conserving what we have in European Union, whereas as some, it was Michael pointed out, US is not really, it's not on the forefront. But social issues are coming in part through millennials and other areas where through COVID, people had a lot of time for introspection, look inside and see what is important. Also, mental issues are also coming through, has been pointed out because of a stay at home and other factors, other technologies. So these are things that have been highlighted, more in disparate amounts in US compared to European Union. Back to Matteo.
Thank you, Arvinder. We have several questions. We have another question here from Anastasius, basically saying, how can we measure sustainability transitions globally? Different that there are values worldwide in different countries, different ways for managing resources, so on and so forth. So which is the panelist view on the measurement of these transitions at the global scale?
Just I might add to this. Yeah, I think that we have already sustainability development report, which is published, I think, every second year. The last one was prepared by Jeff Sachs' team. And of course, we have over 200 indicators which are based on SDGs framework, and we can measure this. But it's, of course, and then when comparing with different countries, we can see the differences. But I think that what we can see is that the huge difference between the group of 35 maybe most developed countries and the rest of the world. And it's the biggest challenge, I think, that even if we are measuring, we can see that the levels are. There was also a question here, developing countries, and what we can do with this sustainability transition in development. And I think that is the real challenge. We can do, under European Green Deal, we can have a similar legislation in some other developed countries all over the world. But what about developing worlds? I have no idea what we can do, in fact. It's the biggest challenge, as not only for governments, also for multinationals, for big companies, which are operating everywhere.
Yeah. One of the things, if I may intervene based on what was mentioned, for developing countries, US has been creating what is called AmeriCorps, and that is very similar to what Rosina was talking about, apprenticeship programs. And I think if we have a lot of population which is available, willing to do things, but don't have the necessary monetary resources, the best program to keep them involved is a gateway to healthcare, which is apprenticeship programs. And rather than creating more MBA programs and everybody either saying no education or go for the gold standard of graduate education, in between there should be apprenticeship program which helps doctors create more health literacy or create more sustainability literacy. That is something that has worked very well, at least in US. We have new in terms of new teachers are going through all over disadvantaged communities through that program, and sustainability interns, as well as health literacy interns. So that's something developing countries can easily emulate and be very successful at it. Thank you.
And maybe, I don't know, Matteo, is it okay to make another comment?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, please go on.
Because
Michael.
I think, what you said, for Italy, where you identified the worst polluters, we could do that very easily on a global scale. And then pool our resources to take care of those issues. And then it doesn't matter if it's, German money going to another country or another country's money going to a European initiative. I mean, we've got to get rid of these worst polluters, and we have to pull together. There is just no way around it.
Thanks, Michael. I do agree with what you just said, absolutely, and also with Arvinder's proposed. Any other comments from the panelists on this topic? Otherwise, we have another question that is quite interesting from Husley, who's basically saying, what about greenwashing? There are a lot of companies, especially those pressured by stock markets, that have to report accordingly to some sustainability legislation. So besides their financial statements, they also have to provide figures and numbers related to their sustainability performance. Some of them we know are in a way, let's say, cheating. What do we think about this? Are there any penalties for these companies? Any comment on this from the panels? Please, Boleslav, go.
Yeah, just one comment. Of course, there is no, other penalties, in fact, that market penalties, consumer boycotts and so on, but it's not so efficient. And I think that what we have now, different kind of regulation, especially for the financial sector. If we will have all this financial taxonomy for non-financial indicators, which is sustainable finance disclosure regulation, which is already in place in European Union, and it will work also globally for the whole financial sector. I think that we will have clear indicators what is greenwashing and what is not greenwashing, what is really green investment and what is just greenwashing investment. And I think that financial sector can be supported by regulations, and it will transfer these definitions, like clear indicators to the different sectors. So it's possible, it will come, I hope.
Something. I also think it's about people. I think it's about people and education and confidence. And maybe this is a bit idealistic, but I think in the end, companies can be held accountable by their customers, by their employees. Governments are held accountable by their voters. We are all voters. We are all, not most of us are voters. We're all employees. We're all customers. So I think it's about using your agency, and it helps you to use your agency when you understand the issues, which links all the way back to what Michael was just saying, and Arvinder was just saying about education and awareness of the issues. So I think we've all got a role to play. We've all got agency of our own to exert in multiple fields in our lives.
Yeah, and just to comment on Rosina's point and Boleslav's point is that there are no legislations that punish greenwashing, but from my research, what I have detected is that there are two main effects on companies' performance. The first one is legitimacy. They are rejected. People ban companies. They stop. They don't consume their products. You see Greenpeace putting Coke bottles in the ocean. They see these campaigns against polluters, right? And the second aspect would be competitiveness. If you are an investor and you see a company that is being rejected by both society and governments, you will be highly reticent to invest in that kind of company because you have no guarantee that your money will be having a good investment or good return, right? So those are the two types of performance consequences of greenwashing, but there still is no legal punishments or to say that attacks this kind of problems. Thank you.
Thanks. We have 5 minutes left, actually, and I would like to actually build on Stefano's comments in the chat. He's basically saying, well, we have to acknowledge that we have to consume less, Okay. In my presentation, I just touched upon the issue of decoupling. Decoupling the economic growth from resource consumption and impact, so CO2 emissions, basically. However, the last IPCC report that Roberto contributed to write, published 1 month ago, actually said that technology alone that mostly supported this decoupling of economic growth from environmental pressures is extremely relevant. It's fundamental, but it will not be enough. It's not going to save us. Will be required fundamental changes in our economic models of production and even more of consumption. We do have to consume less. Therefore, I really would like to build on Stefano's comment and hear the presenter's thoughts about this idea of the fact that we have to consume less. Something that an entrepreneur doesn't want to hear, to be honest. And I'm challenging in class with my MBAs if I do have to propose this idea of post-growth theories. Okay, so what do you think about this? It's really challenging. I'm not proposing one or the other. I'm open to any of them as a researcher, but honestly, I think we have to reflect on this issue. Please.
Can I briefly comment on that, Matteo? Okay. Yes, even in the discussion we have here today, we talk a lot about economic growth and not that much about economic development. So at some point in time, we have to think about what does grow mean. Eventually, we have some literature now talk about degrowth. And degrowth doesn't mandatorily mean, let's say, less development. And so for sure, let's say, we have to think about a change in habits, be that associated with diets, mobility, etc. We're going to need to rethink many things we do now. And in fact, the COVID-19 crisis have shown that some patterns of consumption eventually can be reconsidered. My final comment here, let's say, we really have to realize that although Europe is doing great, US is trying to do great, but if you want to control temperature to well below 2 degrees, this roughly means going down to net zero emission by 2050. And you don't see anywhere in the world where we are very close to have a trend in that direction. So it does mean that in the next 30 years, let's say, substantive changes will need to be done not only on the technological side, but also on the consumption side, because we have to rethink some consumption habits we have today. Thank you.
Thank you very
much. Can I
much,
just
Roberto.
share a couple of little optimistic cases? So
Sure.
I don't know whether you've heard of Depop, which is a national, international brand with clothing reselling. So it's a cross between eBay and Instagram. And among younger students that I teach, they don't buy new clothes anymore. They only buy clothes that have been pre-loved. And that's a business that's grown massively, but obviously it's not growing in terms of resources because it's turning over secondhand clothes. So that's really exciting. There's also a company that I've done a case study of recently called Mud Jeans. It's a Netherlands-based company which leases jeans rather than selling them, with the idea that the jean, I've got a rented jeans I've got on now, you give them back at the end of their life and they then put them back into their manufacturing process. So they've reduced their virgin denim use by 50% since they set up. So I'm not saying that's the answer, but I just like to sometimes reflect on the fact that it is possible, and often it's entrepreneurs that come up with these solutions. They do the impossible, they rethink how we do things and drive that change.
Thanks, Rosina. Michael, maybe you had something. Please.
I was going to just tag into what Rosina was saying, and there was a TED conference called the Uniform Project, and I think Rosina, especially you are in the field, you may be interested in that, where a New York fashion personality took one black dress, the same dress she washed and reused every day of, as long as for the next several years. And every day she'll post a photo of a different accessory, just to show that you don't need to keep buying new dresses. And again, sustainability in consumption of fashion, if you will. And based on that, now we have H&M coming up with a global call for how do you make fashion sustainable. So there are a lot of these undercurrent ideas that are coming through, which again, similar to what you had mentioned, but all taking cultural storm to bring about this idea of sustainability, that we don't need to keep buying new clothes just for the sake of looking. We can do that. But go ahead, Michael. I think.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely true that for developed countries, we need to consume less and consume smarter. Absolutely. When entrepreneurs or businesses hear that, they get scared, and the thing is, there's billions of people in the world that don't consume much at all yet, and in the future, they also should have a right to get something, or, buy a pair of jeans or, a shirt. And so there is billions of potential consumers out there, but definitely for the developed world, consume less. Absolutely. It shouldn't scare businesses though.
Yeah, super. Very, very interesting. The very final point that I would like to make comes from Jose. What do you think about the recent EU and US also thoughts about cross-border carbon taxes? Any comment on this? So basically impose taxes on those products that come from countries that have developed those products not accordingly to environmental laws that are so strict as we have maybe in the EU or in some places in the US. So they have a tax on top of the current price of the product. What do you think about it?
If I can very briefly comment on that, Matteo. Let's say I have been involved in some discussions in the EU about that. The idea is great, but the difficulties of implementing that are very, very high. Because it's very difficult for you really to trace back how products are manufactured in different realities. Because not only products are not exactly uniform, but also is not the supply chain is so long. It's not that easy to really implement that. So I think the issue is much more related to the technicalities behind that than the concept. I think the concept makes sense, but the technicalities would make things extremely difficult to implement.
Yeah. And can I add something to that, Matteo?
Yeah, the last minute.
So just tagging on to what Roberto was saying, different countries we all make heterogeneous products. It's not the same products being made. And so that's one of the factors. The other factor is what exactly happens to the sustainability tax when you collect them? Does it go towards sustainability efforts, or is it just going into the coffers of the government? There has to be some way of offsetting, the in-country sustainability, promoting that so that we are. So it should not be more of anti-dumping or protectionism. It should not be viewed as that. That's all. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jose. I think I can close this panel. Do you want to say a few words of concluding remarks, or we can just move on closing the panel?
I will only like to say thank you to the panelists for an extraordinary session. I am very sorry for the technical problems we had with the breakout rooms. That's, trying new technology is always risky. And here we are, we're suffering the consequences of it. But nonetheless, you rose to the challenge beautifully. And I thank all of you individually and collectively for a wonderful session. And let's hope that many of the lessons that you talked about are going to be implemented in the next few years. Otherwise, not us, but our children and grandchildren will suffer. So thank you very much, all of you, and see you at the next session.
Thank you very much to anyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheers.